Hey, how's it going, Bojan?
Hey Ryan, I'm doing great now that I see you. I also just realized this thing I'm drinking has 270 milligrams of caffeine, so should be
Wait,
kicking
wait.
at any moment.
You joining the caffeine crowd
I'm
or
doing
the
this
Celsius?
thing, yeah.
I've been, maybe we can go get sponsored by them.
Yeah, why not? Why not? Good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Yeah, let's
I'm
kick
looking
this off.
forward. Definitely looking forward to this conversation. Since there was a little bit of some new nomenclature or say new acronyms kind of manifesting, but you know, I'm on a personal note. I will share some of my opinions about acronyms in our industry, so we'll have fun on that one. But hopefully, you're ready to go. Ready to get into this?
I'm ready. I'm excited to discuss multi-factor verification. I've been using the term for the last few weeks just in conversations casually because those are the conversations I have. And, people are definitely curious. And so we figured that we'd start talking about it in a broader sense, really use this as an opportunity to get people's perspectives on this whole thing, talking about the distinction between multi factor authentication and multi factor verification. What are the differences? What are the similarities? How can they be used in conjunction or alongside each other? And then we're gonna do a demo at the end as well. So I'm looking forward to that to the discussion.
Definitely, and I think it would be pretty beneficial to hear some of your thoughts from those conversations as you get to sneak in that new acronym or those new lingo, and to see if people are warming to it, if they're accepting of it, or if they're actually seeing the vision behind it. So I'll be interested to dig a little bit deeper on that as well. But because we usually try to keep these at about 20-30 minutes, we're going to end up having to go pretty quick. Uh, just to kind of reset the context, I think on what multi-factor verification and where it would fit. You and I and all of Hyper, we usually do use the identity, the identity chain, being kind of a great analogy of where in your security program, where in your identity security program might you want to target, where's the common pitfalls, or what is the weakest link. Um, and usually it starts in that life cycle around user onboarding. And I think multi-factor verification will have a pretty big hit on this part of the link, or this part of the chain. Authentication, there could be something to be debated if that's where it would come into play. Uh, Password and MFA reset. I'm going to put that in the bucket as possibly an MFV use case there. And then around endpoint access, I don't know if it necessarily fall right there. There could be maybe some creative use cases if we were to apply.
Yeah,
What's your reader? Your thoughts there?
yeah. I think it can apply to all of these depending on the context, and that's what we'll spend some time talking about too. The user onboarding is particularly interesting. There was recently a post by the folks over at KnowBe4 who do the phishing training, right? And it seems like they didn't know before an employee joined that one of them was a North Korean infiltrator, and so it was just really fascinating scenario where they interviewed somebody, and then the person who got the laptop that they shipped to them, got access to it, and then the first thing they did was start loading malware onto it, which was really interesting. And so, kind of making sure that the person that you interview for a job is the same person that accesses the system on day one of the job is the same person is really important. And that's an area where we're seeing a lot of applicability for multi-factor verification in particular. And so I think it applies to all of these, just depending on the context and the level of risk associated with a particular user's action. There's definitely opportunity for both multi-factor authentication and multi-factor verification across this chain. And the reason that we focus on these four links of the chain in particular is because from all the hundreds of conversations that we've had over the years with identity teams, both big and small, these are the four links that tend to get compromised the most often. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we secure these in particular.
It's not that I'm trying to find the right word. you and I have had talks about a firm. We've talked about the interview fraud in the conversation with other customers and individuals who actually expressed the interview fraud problem or the proxy interview use case. Um, and I'm hats off for Noble for actually posting that information publicly and more or less validating that this is a kind of a widespread scenario. And yes, granted that the North Korean scenario, which we also had the government give out a warning that this was happening, was supported as well. So it gets everybody, right? Like I think it definitely, maybe this does have the justification for the MFV or the new acronym to be driven in a new way of looking at how do you verify individuals as they're either onboarding from a physical identity to their digital identity.
Ditto. So let's talk about the evolution of things, right? So from phishing to social engineering, phishing is nothing new. It's been around for decades, but it's rapidly evolved, right? Especially when we used to get phishing training, even now or last few years, you kind of get trained on looking out for grammatical errors or weird looking links and so on and so forth. But nowadays, with things like ChatGPT and similar tools, they don't make grammatical errors in emails anymore, phishing emails when they send them out. And we've been talking recently about how we used to differentiate between phishing and spear phishing, where phishing is more of like a spray and pray type of approach by the hackers, and spear phishing was where they actually took the time to understand an individual, their role within a company, their geographic location, all that type of contextual data, and then they would craft a specific message for them that is more likely to succeed. Now, if I'm a hacker, that traditionally took longer and more effort to do, but now I can just create an agent that's AI-based and do all that legwork for me and create that really nifty phishing email and send it to that person automatically. And so we're starting to see these large-scale social engineering and help desk attacks start to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of bring up like all the steps that you would have to do, even if you were to be, let's say, a ethical, bad actor, and you have to go perform a pen test, and you were going to obviously find your success. Usually, in a phishing or spear phishing campaign, you would have to do some form of OS int and information gathering in all that context. What would take a couple days, more than a few hours, that you would have to invest. That is done. Like that you could actually just put a list of names and have agents go out and collect all that information for you and make a very, very targeted campaign. And yes, I'm almost thinking that all of our emails going forward, there should be zero grammatical errors, because some of us really suck at writing and really enjoy having that editor on every communication. So there's a plus and a minus to all things, right? Like,
yeah.
Hey, the bad guys get the grammatical errors fixed, and even us good guys can get our grammatical errors fixed.
My average email is like 9 words in length. So if anybody ever gets an email from me that's more than like 2 sentences, it's probably not me.
So if we were to go beyond just that, right? Usually there's a side effect. Usually there's a second part of that email campaign or that phishing, and that's usually going to be a man in the middle, in essence, to try to harvest a credential. I know we were talking quite a bit about Evil Engine X. We can post some links to some videos of other people showing the demonstrations. It's kind of widely been done quite a bit with implementing Evil Engine X, doing phishing campaigns. But usually this is more or less kind of an example of what that attack would look like, right? The help desk social engineering, where there's a decent flow of let's say that the bad actor or hacker or persistent threat targets specific individuals, goes and collects the information from social engineering, and then they escalated to, in this specific case, they escalated their Okta privileges to a super user once they gained hold. And then they moved over to obviously lateral movement and pivoting within the environment for data exfiltration, as well as encryption.
Yeah, let's talk about how like this actually works, right? So There's freely available tools like EvilGenX or Modlishka, right, that hackers can use to do these attacks. And if organizations are, are using apps like OctaVerify or the Microsoft Authenticator app, anything where you're accepting a push or typing in a 6-digit code that you get from an app, basically what they'll do is they'll create a fake website that looks just like the Microsoft or Okta login page. They'll trick you into going to that website, and they'll ask you to type in that code and your password, but it's not really going to Okta, it's really going to the hacker, and then they're using it to log into your Okta environment. And that's exactly what they did here. And then once they're in, right? They can have free reign over the environment, assuming that they're a appropriately privileged user. So, and they'll send these push notifications out to people, late at night when they're kind of tired or doing something else on the weekend, and where they're far more likely to accept it. I was reading one example where the hacker was sending push notifications to an employee and the person wasn't accepting it, right? And then they messaged them on WhatsApp and said, like, hey, I'm not going to stop saying you this until you accept it. And the employee was like, whatever, I'm going to keep going on with my weekend, and just did it. And it only takes one, right? So this is where, even if we're talking about MFA, multi-factor authentication, reducing the reliance on things like OTP and push notifications is critical to prevent these types of attacks. And then there's the entire other attack vector, which is, hey, I'm going to pretend to be an employee who just got a brand new phone over the weekend. My MFA app is on my old phone that I traded in at the Apple store, and I need to get my new app provisioned. So I'm going to answer some questions like the last four of my social and pretend to be this person and get a new credential that way from the IT service desk person. And that sets off an entire new set of moves that they can then run to get access to the sensitive data.
Yeah, I remember the story about the individual who was just being annoyed over and over again, and got their success after they said, "Hey, I'm going to stop doing that."
But look, it gets even more nefarious, right? We've seen instances where, an employee, like a system administrator, right, is getting push notifications that they did not initiate, right? And they're not accepting them because they know not to, right? They're security conscious and everything, and they're doing the right things. But then what happens is somebody sends them a text message to their phone number with a picture of their kid's school. And it says, hey, accept that push notification. Now, you're an employee at a company, sure, work is important, but family's first. You're going to accept it, right? You don't want to risk it. And so these type of phishing attacks, they're changing from phishing to extortion. If the technology supports that type of access, then there's a chance that it will happen.
Yeah, that's when we start getting into threat modeling and the evolution. I mean, there's going to be, like, we do have solutions, right? We have solutions to get around these things.
Yep.
And then obviously the attack vector is going to shift quite a bit and or move to something else, which is part of this game. This is the whack-a-mole game. We'll go protect this stuff. We'll go cover identity. And then what we'll have to go deal with is most likely more malware or anybody who's just downloading software at random, which we're getting even better at as well. To kind of move some things along, this does build out to the expansion of the large scale help desk social engineering attacks. And then we're still in 23, looking at 78% of organizations were targeted still by identity related attacks as well. And now 24, what we're trying to do is bring to light this multi-factor verification acronym, view, approach. I will, if you want to add anything before I go to the next one, because this is where we're going to go into the crediting.
Recently that said like 40% of knowledge workers now work remotely. And so, if that means those people are fully remote, that means you're doing verification of those individuals completely digitally, right? They're no longer if they get a new phone or they need to get back into the system because they forgot their password, they're no longer physically walking up to an IT service desk and being helped. They're picking up the phone and going through some other similar process to verify their identity. And oftentimes that is very insecure and relies on just basic questions that they need to answer.
And that's an interesting statistic that post our pandemic life, right, that we're down to the 40%, right? We had that influx of 100%, or let's go with 95%. And now we're back down to a much lower number, but it's still much, I think, greater than what it was pre-pandemic, right? So going into the level of risk, and once again, threat modeling around how do you manage that with your business? How do you manage that with the onboarding? How is that experience for HR as well as for the employee? At the same time as how are you securing your business with these identities?
Yeah. By the way, what kind of car did you drive in 2004?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I need to go look at like 2004. That was an Integra. I'm not going to give the year, and I'm not giving the mark. I'm not giving the make and year. I mean, color or whatever.
I don't know what account that is your security question for, but now people know it.
Oh, I don't really care. I live by a HYPR's mantra, man. Everything's got passkeys. Everything's got some form of MFA, and it's knowledge-based question and answers are not answered with anything in reference to personal public data. Random generation. There's a wonderful little command with OpenSSL that just randomly generate codes in the past, pre us having password managers.
All right, but this is a really interesting concept that Susan blogged about recently, and she talked about this concept of multi-factor verification, which I really loved, actually. And it really talks about the importance of using multiple ways of verifying a user's identity when they need access to an account, right? So this is assuming that they're not enrolled in MFA, but you have no way of verifying them in person because, for example, they're a remote employee. And how do you determine that level of risk associated with verifying that person? And how do you actually establish trust in that identity? So this is where I think it's really important to talk about the differentiator between traditional multi-factor authentication and what multi-factor authentication actually means.
So I know we and this is where I'm going to be okay, do we need another acronym? Because we have IDV already today. Identity verification does exist. I think it doesn't necessarily fully apply well on the onboarding on the workforce side. Historically, IDV has been applied to financials, banking, and the know your customer use cases. Not applying in the employee or the workforce side. Do we need to have another acronym or label to dictate what identity security should really be at its onslaught? Or am I just being that naysayer who says this on the opposing side, in which as long as we find ways to do risk assessments and verify identities in a clean, cohesive, secure manner from a physical to a digital, assuming that that process does contain risk assessments, I'm not taking a shot at Susan's ideas or anything else. I think we need these things. I just don't know if the industry needs another acronym. What do you think about that?
I think in this case it makes sense because MFA is something that we've kind of burned into people's minds over the last decade or so, right? Every advisory, everything, regulatory body has come out and said, you need MFA, you need MFA, you need MFA. Okay, great. Companies have now deployed MFA, but then we continue to see these massive identity breaches, right? Because the hackers are like, okay, you deployed MFA, that's super. I'm just going to call up the IT help desk and pretend that I'm you, answer some basic questions, and then get into access. So I think this concept of MFV is a really nice evolution that kind of helps people bridge the gap between, okay, it's good that we have MFA, it's absolutely necessary and critical, But if we really want to secure that identity chain, it's not going to be enough. And this MFV is an evolutionary thing there. I think IDV is a great acronym and a concept, but outside of fellow identity nerds like us, right, and fraud folks, they don't really know what it means. Right? I can go out on the street and ask people like, hey, do you use MFA? And they'll know what I'm talking about because chances are at their job they have it. If I go out on the street and say, hey, do you use IDV? They'll look at me, like I'm from a different planet.
Well, and to go on the supportive side is that IDV is also isn't something that's applying it iteratively or over and over again, right? So IDV is kind of a one hit and quit, right? Hey, you've done this one time. Maybe under the MFV umbrella, we're looking at more of a continuous reprompting, not a one-time thing.
That's exactly it. When I talk to organizations, I ask them, hey, when's the last time the company you worked at actually verified your identity? And 99% of the time it's, hey, they did it when I first joined the company 10 years ago and they haven't done it since. I'm like, okay, so if you're a fully remote employee and I'm pretending to be you, they really have no way to truly verify that. Right? And I was talking to one of our customers, a while ago, and they had a really interesting situation during the pandemic where a remote employee, because everybody was remote, unfortunately passed away. And they didn't know that this person had passed away until 3 months later when their spouse came to pick up their stuff from the office. And it was just a really fascinating scenario where like, hey, this person hasn't been active and we haven't tried to re-verify them in an automated fashion. Like that, you would think that type of control would automatically occur on a regular interval given certain signals, but in this case it hadn't. And I talked to a lot of organizations and they openly admit like, yeah, that could definitely happen here.
Yeah, the like any kind of event of that nature. I mean, we could even talk about when we go into here, we'll throw another acronym in there under the IGA context, right? When people's jobs change and entitlements are reissued or given, like maybe that is at a point in time, a re-verification prompt should be taking place then.
Yeah.
Getting it closer to just in time, because I've had plenty of conversations with customers and businesses in which their certification processes for just the access and privilege access at that is something to be desired, right? Like there's room for this to be reviewed a little bit more frequently. And maybe MFV is a way to trigger that as an upfront requirement.
Yeah, and I was really trying to think about how do you talk about the difference between MFV and MFA? And the way that it made sense to me, at least, was MFA verifies the account, right? So if I'm an employee, I have an account with my company, I set up my password, I set up my MFA, and then as long as I have those two things, or anybody has those two things, they're essentially me, right? So that's MFA. MFV is actually verifying that the person who's holding that credential is the person who's supposed to be holding that credential. So it actually verifies the person, not just the account. Now, verifying the person every single time they access the system is more difficult. It's more friction. But we need to have this continuous way of verifying the person when they need to be verified, when the risk is there. And that's what we'll demo here in a little bit. And then verify the account on a much more regular basis, basically every time they're accessing the system.
Yeah, I'm all for it, right? So as we go through the conversations, obviously I'm going to become a champion of something like MFV because it becomes more or less point in time and the friction definition. And I think in the demo kind of will illustrate that, hey, if it's a high risk scenario or if it's somebody who's getting access to sensitive information, maybe it does require that level of friction, because what are we doing this for? We need to find ways to mitigate all the stuff that we have already talked about in the past, the social engineering attacks, the insights. And yes, there are authentication techniques that will help. But at the same time, I think what you were explaining and as you were defining it, Boyan, is like the difference is possession of the credential versus the identity that is holding that possession of the credential, which is a separation there.
That's right. Yeah, let's walk through an example, right, where we can talk about, where you might use one versus the other. So MFA is typically used for credential enrollment. So setting up MFA, changing your password, making sure that the person who interviewed for the job is the same person who's starting the job on day one. Or high value transactions, right? If I'm logging into my single sign-on environment to do basic word processing, great. Let's make that really simple. MFA is good enough for that. But if I'm logging in to do something critical or access to nuclear codes, then you better make sure that you're verifying the person, not just the account.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what we can do is kind of give an idea, maybe a little visual representation of what a flow would look like, at least in the context or how we have envisioned where MFV would apply in a user's experience or in, say, a standard workflow. As users would log into their device, whether it be their mobile phone or their desktop endpoint, they're going to ask or request access to, say, AWS. We're going to use this as a console. We all have businesses that are built on some form of Azure or AWS or some cloud footprint, which has a lot of sensitive data. There's a lot of cloud services that have sensitive data. I'm not going to say names, that may require this type of re-verification before you grant that access. And if that individual is unable to re-verify, you deny them. Maybe it's a reissuance of a credential.
Yeah, and when we were all in an office all the time, this happened almost out of the box, right? Where in order to access the corporate infrastructure, you had to be physically on the corporate network behind the four walls. And not too long ago, like if you wanted VPN access, it was like you were part of a small group of people who had VPN access. It wasn't the entire company. I remember when the pandemic was really starting to kick off in earnest. I was talking to a CTO of a large company, and he's like, we just had to spin up from 3,000 VPN connections to 300,000 VPN connections because their company is that big. And like, that was the big engineering hurdle for them at that time. But, now a lot of the infrastructure that every business relies on is on AWS or Azure or GCP. And so it's perfectly acceptable that somebody logging in to access the CRM like Salesforce, let's have them use MFA to log into that, preferably the phishing resistant kind. But then if they're accessing, our AWS console where they can turn down, all the servers, turn off all the servers, then let's make sure that we re-verify them. And by the way, especially if they're doing this at a weird time of day and from a location that they're not usually coming from.
Oh, yeah, you're bringing up that story about spinning up from 3,000 VPN connections to 300,000. All I was thinking about was, I wonder if they also had to figure out their fiber lines into the offices, because they're probably running VPN servers inside their own data centers. All the other downstream things that come from that challenge that they all had to encounter there. But once again, we've been talking about identity as the perimeter since like 2010, if not longer than that. And I think this is just manifested, right? The pandemic just showed that the identities are going to be floating out there. It is the perimeter. It's not necessarily VPNs. It's not necessarily where now we have to move to SASE. It is cloud access. This data is readily available, and we've seen and we have plenty of evidence of the impact of when these cloud services are accessed inappropriately. But let's see what it would look like if you're a user having to go through this process. I will stop this
while
one.
Ryan is spinning that up, what will happen here is basically what you see here on the screen, which is user logs in, and then when they go to access a sensitive application, they'll have to go through a MFV process, right? And this happens all in line. It's not like they have to, call up an IT service desk or do something completely different. It's just a video of an employee logging in with MFA, and then when they try to access AWS, they have to go through an additional verification step.
All right, so this is gonna. There will be a little bit of high speed speaking. You do get to have the voice of me. This is gonna be me actually accessing our environment, logging in, and we do use passkeys here to authenticate. So even with the security of a passkey being in place, we still want to do a verification post because I'm accessing or I'm going to make a request to AWS. So yes, great security with a passkey, nice, easy, great experience for me as a user, just using my Touch ID. It was previously registered through HYPR. And then now I'm going to make my request for my AWS access. Now, what that does is it takes in context of risk. All right, well, Ryan logged in with a passkey. Is that passkey synced, or is it a device-bound passkey? Is it the right time of day? Is it what is he attempting to access? Ryan's working at 2 a.m. Is that a normal thing? Well, seems to be a pattern from time to time, so it would be legitimate, right? So we can take it through an identity verification. Like we're going to redo a verification, making sure I have possession of the device delivered with an SMS. We're going to check location data as well, making sure that I am operating from that place during this verification. So as Susan was outlining, like risk checks along the way as we go through this, we are also going to do an automated doc auth component, right? Yes, it's a little bit of a challenge because I want to be productive, but I'm going to go ahead and use my driver's license as well as a selfie in order to match. And this goes into context. I'm going to have a successful re-verification. I did speed that part up, but the portion of this that matters is now once that has been completed and the verification of that identity is done, I can then have access to the resources in a secure way, as well as there's auditability, right? So I just went through that verification, the success of that document authentication as well, and I can be reattested back into the environment and accessing this data. So I think there's also a component to this flow, Boyan, that we don't really talk a lot about. Like we're talking about the action of verifying somebody, but I think it's the attestation component at the end as well that's pretty important, that when Ryan was accessing AWS, he did go through this flow, and here's the evidence of that.
Yeah. This is the critical thing, right? Which is like, hey, usually when Ryan is trying to access AWS before using MFV, right? So he'll log into his single sign-on. He will then go to log into AWS, and it might ask him to do his MFA again. But if the hacker already has his MFA, then that's not really an additional factor of authentication. Game's over anyway. So what we can do here is we can say, okay, you use MFA to get into your single sign-on, but then when you try to access this critical system, at a weird time of day, we'll then ask you to also verify your phone number, verify your location, and provide us with your driver's license with a face match. Because I need to know that the person who did MFA is also the right person who should be owning that MFA credential. And companies right now don't really have a way to do that unless they're doing multi-factor verification.
Yeah, I think there's actually another twist to that equation, right? Like we're talking about also the level of authenticator. As much as I think you and I promote passkeys, phishing-resistant authenticators, most of the industry hasn't gotten to the full adoption speed. Obviously, we're going to be excited at Authenticate 2024, where we're going to hear more and more companies have done passkeys. But we're still in that transition adoption phase, which means we need to be able to mitigate situations where non-phishing resistant MFA is still deployed. So I think this actually helps out in that equation as well, because if we were to kind of go back to the successful campaigns that we have had reported to the news, if they had even injected this into that flow, that would have stopped the individuals, that would the bad actors in midstream, mid path, right? Because it would have taken and verified the identity. Granted, there's friction involved, but it would have forced a re-verification of that identity, which those bad actors wouldn't have had. They would have had a session token at one point in time, but they wouldn't be able to do anything else with it.
That's right. And like what you can do is, to leverage, to go back to that know before example earlier, is you can use MFV when you're interviewing somebody, and then use MFV after they start to make sure that it is indeed the same person, and then use that as an anchor of trust for downstream sensitive actions or re-verifications. So the possibilities are endless, and I think as we continue to see organizations using more and more remote work and outsourcing more functions external to their business to contractors or third parties, the necessity for both MFA and MFV to be implemented in tandem and used appropriately where necessary is going to become critical for business continuity and security and staying out of the headlines ultimately.
And I think it's also the evolution of identity. We're getting to that point where we've gotten some of the authentication down. I think we all know the plan forward is passkeys, and it's on to the next part of who actually has that possession of that passkey.
Absolutely.
And we went overtime, though. We were having too much fun, Bojan. We went way beyond the 20 minutes. We even broke our 30-minute barrier. We're about 37 minutes deep. I had a good time. It goes really quick. It always fun when we get to play with these new things, even if it is me, doing a video demo. I think seeing it in action and validating that this may not be that bad if you inject that friction at the benefit of the security, right? I'll leave you with your final thoughts, as I'm pretty sure you want to run off and go on to the next things that are on your list and calendar, which is always full.
Man. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing this again. This is awesome. Lots of fun. Hopefully, to the folks who are watching, you found it beneficial, kind of understand what the differences between MFA and MFV are. As always, Ryan and I, all of HYPR, we're here to help and assist with any of these things, and any ideas or guidance or thoughts that you have to make this more clear, to make this a better narrative, to make this a success in the industry overall, please let us know. We're here and happy to have a conversation anytime.
Oh, we're always open for debates too. If you got opposing ideas and opinions, I want to hear them as well. Make it more fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. See you guys. Have a good afternoon.